Hi, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us. We're here to discuss our newly published Asia Society Australia report on Maritime Southeast Asia conflict decision-making amidst the US-China conflict. So today we are joined by two guests. I've got my co-author with me, Dr. Bich Tran, who's based in Singapore right now, and we'll be delving a little bit into this project. But for those of you who haven't had a chance to open the report, we're going to give you a quick overview about the report itself, and then we will bring in our speakers after that. So just as a bit of background, Bic and I have often been looking at the prospect of major power competition and have often lamented the fact that Southeast Asia is treated much as an afterthought. The prospects of major conflict in the Indo-Pacific are likely to significantly impact Southeast Asian countries, and that's primarily because of the location near sites of potential conflict around the South China Sea or the Taiwan Straits, but also significantly their position relative to major maritime trading routes as well. So the intent of our report is to restore agency to Southeast Asia, to really understand how major power conflict would unfold through their eyes. And so with the support of an Australian Department of Defence Strategic Policy grant, we were able to conduct a 2-year study looking at 5 maritime Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. And we examined 2 major questions. How are these Southeast Asian states likely to respond to a conflict involving the US and China? And importantly, what factors will shape their decision making? Our idea was not to create a predictive model, but to really delve into the kind of factors, whether they be domestic political, economic, social, and informal decision-making influences, to help us understand in a more nuanced and comprehensive way of what the stakes are for Southeast Asia. So a lot of our data was drawn from interviews with retired officials, diplomats, leading academics, and experts. And then we also ran a simulation exercise in October last year in Singapore, where we looked at scenarios involving the South China Sea and Taiwan. Now, before we go to our speakers, I'll hand it over to my co-author, Bic, to talk a little bit about our major findings.
Yes, thanks, and thanks everyone for being here. So several important patterns emerge from the report, about the factors that likely to shape the responses of the 5 maritime Southeast Asian nations to an armed conflict between the US and China. First, both the United States and China ranked among top trading partners of all 5 countries. Second, all 5 nations have their citizens residing in Taiwan and maintain a one China policy. And third, the decision-making process is highly centralized across 5 countries. But however, despite these common patterns, the key influencing factors differ considerably among the 5 nations, and these include first, the level of trade or security dependence on major power. So take trade, for example. China is the top trading partner for both Singapore and Vietnam and other countries. But in the case of Singapore, imports from China only accounted for about 12.45% of total imports. But that figures go up to 40.9% for the case of Vietnam. So in this instance, China has a lot more leverage over Vietnam than over Singapore. And then the second factor is that about political system. So this tells us about who are the key decision makers and how long can they stay in the office. In the case of the Philippines, for example, the president is the most important actor, serving as both head of state and government, as well as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. This person is limited by a single 6 year term limit. So this, according to our interviewees, this could limit the accountabilities because the president doesn't need to worry about re-elections. And another factor is that even within the same country, different administrations have different priorities. Some place economic development above all, while others see sovereignty as utmost importance. So this kind of different priorities also lead to different reactions and foreign policy. And for the role of ASEAN, Our simulation deliberately included only five maritime Southeast Asian countries, partly because of the budget constraint, but also because of the questions that we want to answer. And this create the condition for smaller groupings within ASEAN to come together. Because in real life, ASEAN member states tend to be very reluctant to form this kind of groupings. And the result of our experiment is that ASEAN plus minus X format can sometimes lead to faster and more actionable outcomes. So I stop here and I look forward to the discussion with our guests.
Thanks so much, Vic. So now we're going to delve into the report with the help of two very distinguished experts who are located in the region. So we're joined together with Ja Ian Chong and Don McLain Gill. Let me just give you both a quick introduction. So Ian Chong is an associate professor of political science from the National University of Singapore, where he's currently based. He's also a non-resident scholar at Carnegie China, Carnegie's East Asia-based research center on contemporary China. And one of the reasons we wanted Ian to join us is because of a lot of his research really focuses on the nexus between domestic politics and the international realm as well. But more importantly, the consequences of major power competition on the domestic politics of third countries. And I think in the context of our research, I'd be really interested to know Ian's thoughts on the extent to which domestic politics in countries in Southeast Asia may have an impact on major power competition as well. We are also joined by Don McLain Gill, who is a Filipino geopolitical analyst, author, and lecturer at the Department of International Studies at De La Salle University. He's currently based in Manila. He's also a non-resident fellow at Strat-based ADR Institute and a visiting senior fellow at the Impact and Policy Research Institute and a non-resident fellow at USNAS Foundation. His specialization is the Philippines foreign policy, Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Cooperation, and India-Southeast Asia relations. With Don's extensive view of Philippines' domestic politics and the interplay with strategic policy making, he's also an ideal guest to give us the perspective from the Philippines. So to the two of you, thanks very much for joining us. General question, when you think about armed conflict between the United States and China, let's narrow that down and let's look at Taiwan. From the perspective of Singapore and from the perspective of the Philippines, what's really at stake if the two major powers in our region really go at it over Taiwan?
So what's at stake for Singapore is really stability and maritime access. So for Singapore, we are a maritime state. We are a very trade dependent one as well, and also one that's a financial center. So we need ships to go in and out. We need their safety to be ensured. Also, submarine cables that bring all kinds of data, including financial data in and out of Singapore. Those are important for Singapore's survival and prosperity. And a broader region that is stable is supportive of those kinds of activities. It is also supportive of Singapore's economic relationship across the region, which will be negatively affected should there be major instability. Now, I would also add that this is not just all intra-Southeast Asia. Singapore has very important economic partners in Northeast Asia. So this would include Taiwan, obviously, but also the PRC, Japan, and South Korea. Now, all these connections would be severely challenged in the event of a major conflict. And also, if it brings in the US, and that's another one of Singapore's major security and economic partners. So quite a lot is at stake, although I would also say that many in Singapore, especially outside of the sort of areas that look at security and foreign policy, would prefer not to think about these kinds of scenarios because the possibilities are just too dire.
All right. So what makes it so dire? Besides the economics, is there anything else that really leads to that avoided behavior by our strategic community?
All right.
So if you think about what happens when we move up the escalation ladder, is that both the PRC and the United States would like to be in positions to deny each other's access, right? And so what that would mean is that transit points like Singapore, we have a strategic framework agreement with the United States that allows for transit, logistic support. Washington is likely to call on those. And Beijing, knowing this is not a secret, will probably put pressure on Singapore not to allow US transit. What this translates into in very practical terms would be economic pressure. Companies would come under pressure. There will be a playing up of diasporic nationalism to appeal to certain segments within the ethnic Chinese majority in Singapore. This could lead to a very severe social stress, and that's some of the domestic stuff. Sea lanes leading to Singapore, such as the Malacca Strait, such as the Sunda Strait, and also the South China Sea, would become subject to escalatory kinds of actions. And at the end of the day, if even however the conflict subsides, you could potentially end up with a situation where Singapore's domestic society is quite torn apart, and you have a situation where sea lanes, access to sea lanes, what goes underneath the waters, they are tied to the veto of a major external partner that would severely curtail Singapore's freedom of action. So all this would be on the table. And of course, not to mention, I think there will be severe splits within ASEAN, which would take away a diplomatic leg of Singapore's foreign policy.
So significant second and third order effects, and we're going to come back to ASEAN in a moment. So I'm going to turn now to Don for the view from Manila. Don, what's at stake for the Philippines?
Thank you very much, Natalie. And I completely agree with Ian in relation to the consequences that could arise. Now, for the Philippines, it's a little bit more stark. The situation is of existential value to us, particularly because of our geography. And among all Southeast Asian countries, the Philippines has the closest point-to-point distance from Taiwan. Now, the reason why this is consequential and, of course, existential is the fact that regardless of what happens, or no matter what happens in Taiwan, the Philippines would be drawn to it regardless. Our security interdependence is very much distinct. And to that point, of course, looking beyond the importance of our over 200,000 Filipino overseas workers in Taiwan, we are already seeing clear signs of China factoring in the northern regions of the Philippines as well as the waters adjacent to the north, such as the Strait of Luzon, in its security calculations. Now, as early as 2025, there have already been significant developments as far as trends are concerned. For instance, PLA vessels, China Coast Guard vessels, have been intrusively patrolling closer and closer to the shores of northern Luzon. And this is, of course, quite different from what took place a year prior. And in addition to that, of course, we have seen a number of important movements from the maritime militia, where China has also been mobilizing over 2,000 maritime militia to the north. Now, when push comes to shove, we're looking at a shooting war scenario. Obviously, the Philippines would be deeply impacted, not just because of our overseas Filipino workers, but the fact that this could escalate further beyond Taiwan. And this is, of course, very important. Now, Ian talked about the South China Sea. Now, how the situation when it comes to this invasion, this blockade, this quarantine, and of course, you have to point out that this is not going to be a short or limited scenario. This would be a protracted scenario, most likely, and China does not have the capabilities to ensure that this would be a short-term conflict. So as this would draw out and how eventually this would shape the future of Taiwan, it would have direct implications for Philippine sovereignty and sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. Now, if China is able to alter the status quo to its favor significantly, then this would make it increasingly difficult for the Philippines to more effectively secure its sovereignty and sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. Now, in addition to that, many of our friends in Southeast Asia often treat the situation in Taiwan as a logistical humanitarian issue. It's much more than that, particularly, of course, given the fact that the US and China would likely pressure Southeast Asian countries to give access to their airspace and their waters, which would be, of course, detrimental to the calculations of the conflict. And more importantly, in addition to that as well, there would also be questions in relation to China giving concessions, particularly in promising to evacuate the Southeast Asian residents to China and then eventually to the Southeast Asian countries, and this may entail concessions. For the Philippines, we do not have that luxury. In various tabletop exercises, we've had colleagues from Indonesia, for instance, entertain such a scenario, and perhaps there may be instances where there would be trade-offs in relation to providing access to Indonesian waters. But for the Philippines, it would have to be a direct route. And many Southeast Asian countries are also looking at the Philippines, for instance, as a hub for repatriation. But this would be difficult, let's say, if the conflict escalates to northern Luzon. And it would be increasingly difficult for the Philippines to maneuver in that regard. Now, the last point I'd like to make is the role of the Philippines in this scenario. We would likely see a limited military role as far as the Philippines is concerned, most likely limited to logistics and support. And that's if, of course, this becomes a full-blown shooting war. But I'd like to point out as well that this would not be limited to the Western Pacific. When it comes to a shooting war, that means legitimate targets would be expanded. The scope of legitimate targets would be expanded as well. And this would also involve the Indian Ocean, regardless of the situation, given, of course, that there is a significant presence of both US and Chinese naval assets in that area. So this would likely also create strain for the Philippines, particularly when it comes to the security and welfare of our seafarers, which we are the largest providers of. And if there would be any situation in the Indian Ocean, this would compound our complexities as well. So for us, it's much more than just the immediate neighborhood, but we're looking at both sides of the region.
Can I just add something? I mean, beyond what Don had just discussed, I mean, even right now, as the Philippines and Japan are talking about, maritime issues, we have the PRC trying to do law enforcement in the waters east of Taiwan, which are also sort of impeding on Taiwanese Japanese and Filipino rights potentially. So there is not just going to be a spread of any conflict north and south, but eastward and westward as well. And just the last point I'd like to add, I mean, Big had earlier talked about how South Asian states have a one China policy. That's not entirely correct. Each state has their own one China policy, which are not mutually reducible into each other, although some may be quite similar. And these are also distinct from the PRC's one China principle. These are different things.
Thanks for that, Ian. I mean, I just wanted to pick up on Don's final point about this escalating in some sort of way, to drift towards the Indian Ocean, which impresses upon us the need not just for all Southeast Asian states to be thinking about this issue, but other partners within the region, Australia and India as well. But I just want to go back to the military involvement part of it. You talked about the United States potentially putting pressure on Singapore for the use of logistics and its basing, things like that. What other elements of this conflict would Singapore be thinking about from a military perspective?
So Singapore, apart from the sort of US end, would also have to think about its very extended ceilings of communication. So Singapore, as I said, being a commercial hub, we have ceilings of communication, meaning to say both for ships and also submarine cables extending across the Indian Ocean, across the South China Sea, into the East China Sea, and into the Pacific. All these could become liabilities in the event of a major escalation, because the different belligerents may decide to go after them depending on where they believe that they can sort of force Singapore. And I think for Singapore, the ability to protect these very extended ceilings of communication, typically in peacetime, rely on working with partners. That's going to be a lot more in question when it comes to major escalation. Now, I think also for Singapore, there's the question of a post-conflict situation, whether it whether it faces a veto by other powers in terms of its broader maritime access. And I think the other bit that I would not underplay is the ability to mobilize within Singapore, because if there's going to be political pressure designed to split the population, Singapore's ability to mobilize its population to eagerly defend itself and defend its interests could be called into question. I mean, the Singapore state tries to avoid this as best it can, but if it was subject to major disinformation, political interference campaigns, those are designed to cut into the ability to mobilize even militarily.
I mean, it's easy to think about these kinds of issues where we've got large Chinese heritage communities within certain parts of Southeast Asia. Don, with the ways in which different actors in the region can utilize disinformation campaigns, put pressure on these kinds of social ethnic cleavages as well. Does that play out in the Philippines as well? What might that look like, and what can the Philippines do to insulate itself from that kind of vulnerability or mitigate that vulnerability?
Right, thank you, Natalie. So when it comes to the disinformation campaigns, obviously the cyber domain is the most preferred, and we have seen an uptick of these various information, information activities, particularly since 2023. Now, this is not to say that disinformation or what we call malign information operations, FIMI, for instance, have not been present years prior, but they were merely underplayed and overlooked. However, under the current administration, there's more emphasis on these trends, particularly of malign foreign influence operations. And we have seen, of course, that the common narrative is to malign the Philippine position, particularly in picking up a more proactive role in safeguarding both western and northern regions of the country, of the archipelago. We have seen a lot of disinformation campaigns targeting the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites, many of which are located in the north, and of course the Balikatan exercises, which have also concentrated a lot of effort in the northern sections of the archipelago, particularly bearing in mind, the year 2027, the Davidson window, as they say. The Philippines takes this with great seriousness as well. Now, in that case, we have seen a lot of attempts also to discredit the growing security partnerships of the Philippines, and most especially targeting the growing and deepening comprehensive strategic partnership we have with Japan. And much of the narratives, of course, are there to show that the Philippines is a troublemaker, that it's the Philippines and the current administration that is poking the bear, so to speak, and that the Philippines should fall in line, pursue once again an approach of appeasement towards Beijing, in order to ensure stability and peace. And this also undermines the fact that it is China that continues to create negative conditions that in fact destabilize the security interests of the Philippines and of course the civilians. As we have known, in late 2025, in November, if I'm not mistaken, this was the first time that the China Coast Guard targeted civilian fisherfolk of the Philippines within our exclusive economic zone in the Sabina or Escoda Shoal. And of course, along with that, there's always been this trend. And the most important part of this information that I'd like to highlight is local co-option, which is again another growing trend in the country. Local co-option has been a problem, particularly because we have not also updated our espionage laws, and we have seen how this has become a domestic issue as well. We do not have legal measures up to now, the updated legal measures to curtail these local co-opters of disinformation. So therefore, this would have to begin through a national domestic legal process, which is something that is currently being done, but not being done fast enough based on the trends and the speed of the disinformation campaigns. So we're faced with a number of different scenarios right now, and these trends would likely exacerbate, given, of course, the tensions that are happening across the strait. And one more point I'd like to add is that there have been a number of notable developments when it comes to these foreign malign information operations as far as late last year as well. I'm not sure if you were aware, but there was this event that took place in Manila that was organized with PRC-backed organizations in the Philippines, and at the same time members of the Chinese embassy in Manila. And the whole idea of this was to support the reunification, or rather the unification of the PRC and Taiwan. And this was one of the rare occasions when Filipino Chinese, the Chinoys, as they say, were not called as Filipino Chinese, but overseas Chinese residents. So you can see, of course, that the trends and the narratives are becoming more sophisticated in this regard, and this will likely continue, especially since there have also been attempts to create institutions that that also promote the idea of unification between China and Taiwan. And this has been happening since late last year. So these trends are likely to persist in the Philippines, if not strengthen even more.
Right. So could I just quickly add that this sort of co-optation, disinformation, we can call that phase zero. That's been happening across Southeast Asia. Now, so we can move up the ladder of escalation, right? So the other thing, there'll be cyber attacks. We've seen them across Southeast Asia as well. Singapore had its critical infrastructure come under attack last year. There was no official attribution, but we would see potential, that potentially come up. You may also be able to expect, if we get further escalation, sabotage, precision strikes. These are all within the realm of possibility.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of things, different dynamics that we've got to think about other than the actual shooting war, the other kinds of social dynamics and vulnerabilities within critical infrastructure. I want to come back to the issue of the relationships of Southeast Asia and external partners. But before that, I want to just get an insight into how do Southeast Asian states see what is happening to each other? So specifically, Ian, in response to all of the things that Don has talked about, the perspective of Manila in terms of dealing with the pressures from China, how does Singapore view what Manila is doing as a form of resistance and a form of mitigating these kinds of vulnerabilities?
So Singapore's position is fairly interesting, and there's been some shifts over the past decade. Now, or decade and a half. Now, when the arbitral tribunal process first began, Singapore was relatively open in saying that it would abide by the rule of law and would recommend that other actors do so. So whatever the ruling countries should comply because if they're members of UNCLOS, right? Not if they're party to UNCLOS. Now, under there were several incidents. There was the detention of Singapore armored vehicles transiting through Hong Kong. There was the non-invite of the then Singapore Prime Minister to the Belt and Road Forum. Singapore has pared back and has just talked about adherence to UNCLOS more generally. So where I'm going with this is with the Philippines. Yeah, there is, not that much spoken in public in sort of more semi-closed kinds of fora. There is some blaming of the Philippines for being a troublemaker. But at the same time, what I understand from actually Filipino colleagues is sometimes in more intimate settings, the Singapore side is actually okay with the Philippines sort of keeping attention on maritime access and South China Sea and so on. So I guess there are lots of mixed incentives. Singapore, I think, would like to see open maritime access, but at the same time, it is concerned about pressure and potential punishment coming from Beijing, and would rather not stick its neck out. So I don't know. I mean, it seems that when you talk about an ASEAN minus X formula, there's a lot of eagerness to do a ASEAN minus 10, and maybe soon ASEAN minus 11. Be great.
Just so indeed, that's one of the things that we were trying to understand better. It's like, well, where does ASEAN sit in all of this? What would happen to ASEAN in this context? So it's interesting for us to sort of peel back the layers and look at the intra-ASEAN dynamics first. Now, that's the view from Singapore.
I think it would prefer to lie down rather than sit smaller target.
Well, I think that's important to draw out as well, because where does ASEAN centrality, where does that go amidst the actual shooting conflict? We have a lot of discussions about what ASEAN can and cannot do, but I think it's interesting and important for us to kind of hash out under conditions of conflict what that might look like. What are the limits of ASEAN in this case? Don, from your perspective, does ASEAN have a role if the shooting war happens? Is it helpful that Singapore has this perspective? What would Manila want more from its siblings, its Southeast Asian brothers and sisters?
Well, as far as the Philippines is concerned, first I'd like to touch on the point of Ian, which is absolutely correct. Behind closed doors, there has been a more tempered, more understanding tone among Southeast Asian countries towards the plight of the Philippines and particularly what the Philippines is doing. There have been efforts to socialize this to a significant degree. Behind closed doors, you have even countries like Indonesia that voice out not support necessarily, but understanding. They even incorporated the 2016 arbitral award into national legislation, which shows, of course, the importance. Vietnam has been relatively more vocal about the significance of the 2016 arbitral award. But of course, when it comes to ASEAN and what ASEAN can do when push comes to shove, I mean, when it comes to the blatant aggression, the illegal activities. In the Philippines, we call it ICAD when it comes to China's activities. We don't we don't stick to the idea of gray zone anymore. We feel that we have to call it as it is. ICAD is illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive activities. The Armed Forces of the Philippines has officially has been using that terminology to talk about Chinese activities. So when it comes to these ICAD operations by Beijing, obviously, we would have wanted some voice of support coming from ASEAN, particularly since whatever is happening is in line with what ASEAN stands for, and that is the preservation of the rule of law. The signing of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation was to ensure that there was no revisionism, no unilateralism play at stake. But of course, understanding that ASEAN at the heart of it is intergovernmental, and we have that understanding of the limitations of ASEAN when it comes to these high political traditional security issues. Now, when it comes to a scenario in Taiwan, unfortunately, I do not think that ASEAN has the right. Well, not necessarily the right. I mean, ASEAN is filled with mechanisms, but I'm not sure if ASEAN has the will to actually stand up and act collectively, which is again understandable. We already have fragmented ideas about what each of the Southeast Asian countries would do in terms of a Taiwan contingency. So the most that I could hope for is that Southeast Asian countries should become more open to pre-crisis coordination exercises. I think that this is the least common denominator that Southeast Asian countries can do. You know, we shouldn't think about the idea of a collective action of ASEAN when it comes to this Taiwan contingency scenario. The most we could do, the most we could hope for, is that Southeast Asian countries would openly share information, share data about what each of these countries are doing, so that we can more effectively harmonize national efforts. But to say that there would be one collective ASEAN response, I think that that would not likely be the case, given how things are going right now. I could be wrong. You know, there could be the Big Bang that could catalyze an immediate sense of ASEAN oneness for Taiwan, but in case of a push comes to shove situation. But so far, I hope that Southeast Asian countries will be more open to pre-crisis engagements. That's something that we are currently lacking, despite that we have mechanisms for consular assistance, for rehabilitation, and all these. ASEAN has it. You name it, they got it. But the thing is, when it comes to the operationalization of these in terms of coordinating in crisis, and this was the theme of my recent conference, it seems to be lacking. And that is something that needs to be done. That, you know, hopefully Southeast Asian countries get to, you know, socialize this more effectively.
Let me just say also quickly that, I mean, Southeast Asian states, ASEAN, should be thinking actively about conflict prevention. In addition to sort of preparations for crisis management, because if we get into a crisis, we get into very rapid escalation, that's going to be too late. You want to prevent crisis, but there's a severe collective action problem. There's no appetite or political will to engage in that. And I think some of the consequences we have already seen, right? If you look at the Thai-Cambodia border conflict, basically, most of ASEAN was quiet. Malaysia, as chair, had to step in, and it wouldn't have been able to move forward without assistance, pressure from the US and the PRC. Now, for something that's potentially even more high stakes, like you know, major escalation over Taiwan, those dynamics will probably be amplified.
Oh, so you know, it's interesting that Ian talked about conflict prevention because, you know, remember during our trip with Natalie, you know, to the regional countries when we did our interviews, and we noticed that Southeast Asians, you know, people who we talk to often use the term. And you know, to compare with, you know, like for example, the US or Australia, you know, they talk about deterrence, but in Southeast Asia, we talk about conflict prevention. Yeah.
Right, there's a lot of talk about it, but I don't see this translate into action.
Well, I think the other issue is ensuring that Southeast Asian states have at least an understanding of what deterrence or conflict prevention means from the perspective of their neighbors as well. I think there's a little bit of lack of knowledge coordination there. You've all mentioned this idea of political will. Now, moving out of Southeast Asian capitals, I would like to ask both of you, how is the political will of major actors such as the United States viewed? Most of our talk thus far has focused on the actions of China. When Bich and I conducted our information gathering early last year, that was before the United States had really enacted a really punitive slew of tariffs. How do each of your countries view the United States now? Ian, from the perspective of Singapore's basing logistics relationship, Don, from the perspective of the Mutual Defense Treaty. Ian, can you go first and just tell us how the United States is being viewed?
So when you did the interviews, it was also before the military action against Venezuela and Iran. And so the net result of all of this is a lot more uncertainty. There's a lot of questioning over the direction and the volatility and consistency of US policy. And there is also, so that gets into sort of two ends of the spectrum, right? There's concern that the US may decide to be escalatory. There's also the concern that the US may decide that it wants to just focus on the Western Hemisphere and be less committed to Asia. So from Singapore, they would prefer neither of these extremes, but it's unclear where the US will go. They are trying to engage other major actors more, including Japan, including India, and also sort of other actors that could be consequential, the European Union, Australia, Canada, in order to give everyone a stake in stability. But that pulls countries together, but it doesn't set any direction in particular. So I think that's the state of play right now.
Now, when it comes to the United States, clearly we have to be fair. I mean, there has been a lot of skepticism about US commitment in the region. But as far as the Philippine-US Security Alliance is concerned, it's still going pretty well. It's still quite strong. It continues to be robust. Exercises have become more sophisticated over the past few years. And more recently, the US has passed a budget of around $2.1 billion for assisting the Philippines for our defense acquisition, our modernization. There have also been a number of activities to modernize our Coast Guard. So to be fair and frank, the security partnership, bilaterally speaking, is going quite well. This is not to say, however, that it is completely a land of milk and honey, because we have to understand it's not enough that the Philippine-US alliance is doing good. The Philippine security is dependent also on the various security networks within the Western Pacific. And if there would be problems with that, then there would also be significant implications for the Philippines. So we couldn't sit, without stress, thinking that, okay, our alliance is going good. That's we shouldn't worry about anything else. Now, if, for instance, the Philippine or the U.S.-Japan alliance faces roadblocks, or the U.S.-Korean alliance faces roadblocks, then that would also have direct implications for us. So we are not completely ostracized from the other security networks, because we are a hub and spoke system to begin with. So it's very much interconnected. Now, the other concern we have is how far the U.S. would go to support Taiwan. Now, obviously, we're talking about a worst case scenario already, a push comes to shove scenario where the US is involved, right? However, there are certain signals that are also concerning to us here in Manila. For instance, the delays in the arms package that the US is supposed to provide to Taiwan. There have been significant delays in that regard. Second, of course, is the fact that China has been using the arms package as a negotiation element with the US when it comes to Taiwan, which was not necessarily the case years back. So there is also a constant push in Beijing to actively rewrite the narrative of the US-China dynamics on the Taiwan Strait as well. Now, it is still too early to say whether or not this is concerning, but this is a legitimate concern for the Philippines, because it is not enough that we are doing well. If China were to decide to invade Taiwan, and a U.S. response would not be up to par with what it must, then it goes back to our first conversation. There would be significant implications for the Philippines, for Singapore, particularly Maritime Southeast Asia to begin with, and slowly expanding eastward and westward. So in that case, again, my last point here is it's not enough that the Philippine-US alliance is doing well. The entire network has to do well for the Philippines to be comfortable in this position.
I think in the past, we used to kind of associate economic coalition with China. But now with the current administration in the US, we realize that any dependence on any major power is vulnerabilities. And I think for Vietnam, it's a real wake-up call because back in 2014, when China sent an oil rig into Vietnam's EEZ, the prime minister back then already issued a directive saying that Vietnam should reduce dependence on any single partner or market. And 12 years later, here we are, still very much dependent, and not just one, but now two major powers.
I just wanted to move this conversation back to something Ian mentioned. And it ties into how Don was saying now we need to look at beyond just the bilateral relationships that we've got between Southeast Asian states and major powers. Is there anything we can do today about getting a sense of shared direction between not only Southeast Asian states, but other major players within the hub and spoke network, or other major players such as India, who may not be any part of that formal alliance, but have a significant stake in what might unfold?
So I think there we are going to pull at the seams of ASEAN. Not all ASEAN member states are fully comfortable with this hub and spokes idea or the way that operates. Some are. So what we could see is a different states moving in different sort of aligning perhaps differently in different ways, which would exacerbate any collective action problem that already exists within ASEAN. So the fact that sometimes people talk about Southeast Asian states as swing states, the general sort of assumption is that they'll be wooed by major powers, but the other possibility is that they will all be sort of beaten over the head and coerced by major powers, all of them, in order to ensure compliance. So I guess it depends on where the sort of comfort level for each capital and its population might lie. And the fact that you're up for grabs, your alignment is up for grabs, means to say that you are going to be a field for competition. So that direction, I don't think is set. I think very likely the major powers will want to force actors into different positions. And that's a reality that Southeast Asian states, I think, intellectually understand, but no one wants to move quickly enough on reducing dependencies, as Bich had mentioned, because that incurs short-term costs. No one wants to be in a position where you offend either Washington or Beijing. And already we are seeing sort of bits and pieces of this where you see the tech restrictions from both Washington and Beijing, what Singapore can do with Russia, creating concerns in all kinds of pressures I think are building.
Don, I just want to see what you thought, what more you can add to that.
Thank you. I think that there is, in fact, quite a dynamic set of responses and interests among even the major powers concerned. You talked about India, Japan, Australia, and even the European. The Europeans, first of all, would most likely not want to get involved in this at all, despite the fact that they have their own Indo-Pacific strategies laid out, or Indo-Pacific concepts laid out. If you go closer to the region, you have countries like India that's still pretty much reluctant to even talk about or consider any discussion on a Taiwan contingency. And this is the reality in Delhi. And in a perfect situation, you would expect that, okay, if the situation escalates in the Taiwan Strait, and you might see India wanting to open up another front along the line of actual control, but that's unlikely going to happen. So there's a lot of caution in India as well, especially when they're trying to manage their relations with Beijing, and there's a little bit of friction with Washington as well. So they are quite mindful of not stirring the pot too much. I think the closest we have to a major player taking this with utmost seriousness is Japan. And we have also seen the constant evolution of the free and open Indo-Pacific concept from Prime Minister Abe. It was refined under Prime Minister Kishida, and now it has taken up a more defense-oriented position under Takaichi, who has increased the budget on official security assistance, has tried to merge the ODA with the OSA, which is significant, and continues to push for a more active role. It has terminated its multiple decades worth ban on exporting, weapon systems, frigates, and other assets that have potent effectiveness compared to what was the usual scenario, the traditional scenario. So we see Japan slowly coming out of its shell, and this is also partly because of the lack of the increase in concern in relation to U.S. commitments. So you see Japan playing a role, and obviously Takaichi follows, the mantra of Prime Minister Abe that a Taiwan contingency is also a Japan contingency. So there is, in fact, a lot of effort from Japan to work with the Philippines, particularly in this regard. Australia, I couldn't say much about Australia. I think that it's internally still divided as to whether the situation across the strait would be a situation that would be limited to that area, or would it expound to areas that would be crucial for Australian national interest? But clearly, Australia has huge stakes in this as well. So hopefully there would be more coordination. And I think that when it comes to the major players concerned, there is a lack of an avenue where they could actually engage and coordinate in relation to this rather than doing it ad hoc. I mean, the closest we had was Quad, but the Quad now is pretty much in the refrigerator. And it is, that's a reality for now. And there is no significant platform where major players could actually engage and create scenarios to prepare for such instances. So everything is still ad hoc. So in that regard, the responses are fragmented, but we do see certain players trying to step up. And hopefully, as the situation becomes more structurally challenging, you'd see more players jump in as well.
I'd say that Japan is also a special case in the sense that part of its concerns are very similar to the Philippines because of geography. It cannot escape. And I think also we have to, some of the report also, I think, takes Taiwan, doesn't take sort of Taiwan's effect as much because we also have to remember that it supplies about 90% of the world's high-end semiconductors. So there will be severe supply chain constrictions around the world.
Indeed. So I think you've all highlighted areas where really as us as scholars and our colleagues as practitioners need to investigate. Don, in particular, you talked about the Quad as a construct that was once filled with a lot of hope and anticipation, now potentially sidelined as well. My final question to you both, we all work as scholars and thinkers in this field together closely with our practitioner colleagues as well. What might be priority areas for further research, particularly where it's policy relevant and related to Southeast Asia?
Okay, so I would go back to what Don had said earlier to think about crisis management scenarios, but I think also to think about conflict prevention as well. Of course, conflict prevention also includes deterrence. Deterrence is a pro-status quo approach, right? And it's just that I think for many Southeast Asian countries, they are afraid of the sort of potential security dilemma potential possibilities for escalation. But I think if we were to think seriously about maintaining stability, everything needs to be on the table. And I get it that it's difficult for governments to move. There's a lot of inertia, but to get thinking moving along these lines is probably I would argue it's already too late, but it should definitely still happen. It's better to do that than to sort of be caught unawares, and probably I think to believe that some other state somewhere will step in and help solve your problems is A, unrealistic, and B, really undercuts this idea of agency in Southeast Asia and ASEAN centrality. ASEAN, as I've said many times, in such an instance, will essentially be a donut hole, right? It'll be hollow in the middle.
Well, I completely agree, and I'd just like to briefly add that Southeast Asian countries must take more responsibility when it comes to governing and having a say when it comes to any situation that's happening within their immediate neighborhood. On one hand, we have Southeast Asian countries being concerned over the erosion of their autonomy, but on the other hand, there is still reluctance among Southeast Asian countries to actually talk about matters that matter for their shared region. And I think that is a mindset that needs to be changed. ASEAN has showed in the past how even difficult situations, difficult decisions were made through proper and long-term socialization. But my concern here is that there's not a lot of time. Ian said it right. We're actually quite late. We're quite delayed, but still we should take advantage of the situation of whatever time we have in order to engage in this arrangement. So as for me, that should be the way to go.
Right. If we want agency, we got to invest in the institutions. We got to invest in the preparations and be ready to use them if push comes to shove.
Absolutely. There's a lot more there to do and a lot more coordination between Southeast Asian states and with Southeast Asian partners as well. For your expert insights, for your deep dives into each of your respective countries, the way in which you've animated the different vulnerabilities from Chinese coercion and US coercion, the challenges of lack of coordination, the role of ASEAN and each of your individual domestic vulnerabilities as well. I thank you both on behalf of Bich and I for taking your time to share your knowledge with us. Ian and Don, thank you so much again. To our audience, I just wanted to highlight the fact that our report is now available online on Asia Society Australia's website. And in addition to this virtual roundtable, we also have a series of videos and other events that will be online that will explore other elements of this conversation. So hopefully this is one contribution we've made to a much larger conversation where there is certainly, as you've both highlighted, areas for us to commit to, and we hope to work with you together on that. So to all of you again, to everyone at home, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to continuing this conversation again in future.